Добрий день, 22 червня, мене звуть Ольга Таманова, я рада вітати всіх у медіа-центрі Україна Ukrinform. 10-й рік триває війна, і сьогодні вже 484-й день від початку повномасштабного вторгнення російського агресора на нашу
aggressor. And I traditionally want to thank the representatives of all the mass media who tell the world the truth about our heroic resistance and tell us the truth about this war. Today we have invited all of you to present an analytic material, a material that is called From Bryansk to Irkutsk, what happens to captive Ukrainians behind the walls of Russian prisons. Our experts of the Media Initiative for Human Rights, which is a part of Ukraine 5 AM coalition, gathered the information, analyzed it, and now they present this analytics to us. They will tell us what they've managed to find out about the conditions our prisoners of war are held in the aggressor country. Our speakers today are Tetyana Katrychenko, the coordinator of Media Initiative for Human Rights, Maria Klymyk, investigative journalist at the Media Initiative for Human Rights, Andriy Yakovlev, lawyer and expert with the Media Initiative for Human Rights. Also joining us is Iryna Latysh, a prisoner of war relative, and Natalya Yepifanova, head of the Warriors Liberation Public Organization, and she's also a relative of a prisoner of war. So, Ms. Tetyana, let's start this conversation with you. What have you managed to find out? What do the analytics tell us? What have you found out from our liberated prisoners of war? What are the conditions they're held in? What's going on over there? Good morning, dear journalists, dear colleagues. Thank you for attending this event. It's very important. We want to thank the Foundation Vidrozhina, which supported our project. I'm about to tell you why I'm telling you from the very beginning, because the topic of confinement and transportation of the prisoners of war is less studied, and it's not so comfortable and sometimes even horrific. This is why it's not everybody who can study this topic, and Media Initiative for Human Rights studies this topic from the moment of our foundation. We studied the places of confinement in occupied territories way before the 24th of February 2022. We knew the places our Ukrainian servicemen were held captive, and starting from summer 2014 we were doing it. Oftentimes we were doing it without any payment, on a volunteer basis. We were realizing that we cannot lose either time or the witnesses of those events. This work that we're presenting today, the places of confinement in Russian Federation, is a part of a work that we're doing for a long time, but still it's new to us. If we know almost about any place of confinement in the occupied territories, and it's easy to find out about some new place of confinement that was established upon the 24th of February 2022. So in case of Russian Federation, its territory was almost free from such places of confinement, apart from the people who were detained in Crimea and then were transported to Moscow or Rostov or elsewhere in Russian Federation. Russia continues using the same places, both in Moscow and Rostov, but they were added by a large number of other places where Ukrainian citizens are detained, both servicemen and civilians. But today we are talking about the servicemen. I apologize. And it's a huge number of Ukrainian citizens who were moved to Russian Federation. We're talking about thousands. And it's obvious that the Russian Federation lacks space for detaining them. In the beginning of the invasion, they were thinking that they were about to finish this so-called special military operation quite quickly, and they booked a number of confinement cells and colonies in the regions neighboring on Ukraine, in Bryansk and Rostov and Voronezh and Kursk regions. They vacated the colonies for detention of our Ukrainians there, but then as they were realizing that their plans are not about to come true, they started moving the captive servicemen in the depth of the Russian Federation. We know even that some of them were kept captive in Irkutsk, in the very depth of Russian Federation. It's a little bit emotional, but by those places of detention I started doing something I never wanted to. I started studying the map of Russian Federation, where those places of detention are and where they are. I'm talking about such places as Pakino, Kokhma, Galich, Kashin, some places that were unknown to us, or to me specifically. Definitely it's no positive experience, but it's very important to know those small settlements where those colonies are located, so that we can find our Ukrainian citizens, because Russian Federation all the time keeps moving the Ukrainians and thus trying to conceal them. So we are not 100% sure that we may be able to find our citizens of Ukraine shortly or afterwards. Our colleagues may tell you a little bit more about all those stories. We questioned more than 50 different servicemen who were liberated from captivity. We've heard that sometimes the evidences are being repeated, and we've realized that we know a lot already about such places of detention, like confinement cell number 2 in Novozybkovo or in Kursk, but geography is expanding, and it's important to understand too. And behind the walls of all those more than 40 places of detention, there are no spectators, so to say. And in those places of captivity, horrible things are happening, like tortures. We know about the cases of deaths of servicemen in captivity, when people were dying as due to unidentified reasons, and then their bodies were expatriated within exchange procedures. And it's horrific because it's about young people dying. Well, maybe there will be questions, but I would like to give the floor to my colleagues. Miss Maria, we know that you were communicating with our liberated prisoners of war, so what do they say specifically about the conditions of the detainment? Good morning. Everybody keeps saying, regardless of the place of detention, that doesn't matter whether that place is in the depth of Russia or is it close to the Ukrainian border, the conditions of detention are more or less the same everywhere. First is the acceptance point, then another place of confinement, then it's like a mandatory thing that they're being beaten. What they say is like a registration and acquaintance. Then another mandatory procedure is the fingerprint sampling, because if they end up in some territory that is under control of Russian Federation, that they could be detained again, then they're being brought to their cells. And as Tetyana mentioned, the space is not enough for such a big number of prisoners of war, and many of them, they mentioned that they had additional bunks in their cells, because obviously Russians didn't count on such a big number of prisoners of war. Those cells were allocated for 4 people, for example, but there were 8 people put in the cells, so there should be additional bunks put in the cell. And what's most difficult is the absence of food. The prisoners of war are being kept without food there. What they were eating is the absence of meat, no fruits or vegetables. The food is always non-salty and underboiled, but the only thing that was enough was bread, thanks to which they were able to survive. But by their pictures of those liberated from captivity, we can see that they were losing weight, and thus we may understand that they were fed quite bad there. And in the majority of cases of those liberated from captivity, the only phrase they were repeating, regardless of the place of their detention, is that if you are being driven outside the camera, the probability is high that you are about to be beaten. So for them, anytime they're being taken from the cell meant that they were either brought for interrogation, where they were again beaten, or they were pressed against the wall and beaten again, or they were taken for a walk where they were beaten once again, or sometimes were, as it was happening in the Voronezh region, there were dogs attacking the prisoners. It was kind of entertainment for the guards. They were working out there, or they're training their fighting techniques on them. And also another problem is the absence of medical aid. Even if people were in need of medical attention urgently, those medics were always delaying, or they were refusing to help those held in captivity, or was a pill of Validol as a panacea against all illnesses. And sometimes even the doctors themselves, they could harm the prisoners of war, so while treating them they could hit them on the back or just psychologically torturing them. So any comment regarding those places of detention were all of negative nature. The guards, they were happy to have power over the Ukrainian prisoners of war, and they were trying to torture them both physically and psychologically, because our Ukrainians, they had no information about what was going on in Ukraine. All the information they were getting, it was distorted, and those who ended up in captivity in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, they didn't know anything. They were just finding out some pieces of information from those who were coming to their cells later on. So this is how they were able to keep track of what's going on in Ukraine. Also, in some places of detention, the outside walks were non-existent. People could spend half a year in a cell without sunlight. They were never knowing what hour, what day it was. They were making scratches on the walls not to lose the track of time, and many were saying that it was very difficult for them to stay without normal conversations, because when a new person is being put in your cell, everybody was afraid to say something because they never knew what kind of person that was, and the information they were about to provide, it could cost them a lot. This is why the absence of normal communication impacted the psyche a lot. And as Tetyana mentioned, we are also aware about a number of death cases. It's the result of the fact that the prisoners of war, they end up in those places in captivity with their immunity system weakened, just like those who were staying in Azovstal or in Ilyicha industrial facility, and they were beaten, they were electrocuted, the tasers used against them, plus the absence of food and absence of normal medical care, it affects the human health so bad that even the young boys, 20-30 years old, they just start having heart failures. They die just due to the conditions of detention. Ms. Maria, will it be correct to say that all of our prisoners of war are subject to the tortures? Yes, we are even aware of the cases when the tortures were used against not only men but women too. So they make no difference whether those are male or female. If you take up the arms, you're the enemy and you're about to be tortured. Well, we've heard such stories from our liberated prisoners of war that they were forced to listen to the anthem of Russia, and so there was some information pressure exercised against them. Oh yeah, anthem of Russian Federation is the mandatory program in any place of detention. This is what the morning of every single prisoner of war starts with. They should learn it by heart, and even if you forget even one single word, they are being punished for that. So Russian anthem, Russian music, this is something that they listen to every day. Mr. Andriy, talking about the legal component from the international law point of view, how can you evaluate what's going on with our prisoners of war? Good morning. It should be assessed as a war crime. Why is it a war crime? Maybe it's even more than a war crime. Maybe sometimes it will be identified as the crime against humanity, because the picture we're seeing is that everybody is beaten just for no reason, just for entertainment, or like instead of saying hello, it's some kind of practice that cannot be explained by any military necessity or any other real reasons. We have to understand that it's important to understand that prisoners of war are no criminals. They were just the people who were isolated from warfare to weaken the enemy. They are isolated and they are deprived of freedom. They cannot get back in ranks or of their armed forces, or they cannot get back home, but they have all other rights. For example, right to correspondence. For example, the Geneva Convention guarantees at least 4 postcards or 4 letters that can be sent outside, and this is one of the ways of connection with the outside world, which is one of the basic guarantees. Why it's important to mention it? Because if we imagine that there is a huge number of people, thousands of people who do not have any rights, they are being beaten on a daily basis as punishment, as entertainment. In this research you may find information that even their food is eaten before they are being served it. According to the Geneva Conventions, the feeding should be at least such that people don't lose weight, so they are being fed in violation of Geneva Conventions. And torture is a very serious thing. They actually constitute the war crime. That's very brief. Thank you very much, Ms. Iryna. I would like to invite you to join our conversation and share your personal experience, what your family was facing. Yes, thank you very much for invitation. Unfortunately, I also have this negative experience in our family. A close relative is being held captive as a prisoner of war. I was communicating with the guys who were held captive with my husband and those who came back from other places of detention. And what I want to add to what was already said by the previous speakers, that unlike other places of detention that exist in the occupied Ukrainian territory, sometimes the captives are allowed to receive some packages from the volunteers, or there is mobile communication. Sometimes it's unsanctioned, sometimes it's upon the agreement with the guards. So those who are held captive in Russian Federation, they don't have any of those opportunities. Just in addition to what was said about the absence of communication, about letter exchange. For example, our family, we received a letter from captivity almost a year ago, we were really comforted with that. I was thinking, like, all right, his head is still thinking, his right hand can still write. Obviously, there are very primitive things described there, like I'm alive, I'm not starving, everything is fine, relatively healthy, and that last guy that was liberated on the 11th of June, for example, in Voronezh region, they were weighing the prisoners of war, and everybody was surprised why they lose weight. So as of 30th of May, my husband lost like 30 kilograms of weight, but I hope we will cope with it. Regarding the medical care, like Maria mentioned, it's very difficult. The medical care is accompanied by some physical manipulations. If you complain about having stomach ache or headache, you're being given some pill like once in 3 days, and you don't even know what kind of pill it is. Is it ibuprofen or is it a purgative? People don't really realize what's going on. I cannot assert the way the medical care is taken about the heavily wounded, because I have no such experience. I only have the information from the open sources, but those who conditionally said have some light health problems, no one even pays attention to it. If you have stomach ache, you don't better mention it, because you're gonna have your ribs broken, and you're not only going to have your stomach hurt, but also other parts of the body. Also, those who were brought back from captivity, they mentioned that in Voronezh region they are let outside for a day walk. Before that, they were not let outside. They did not understand whether it's day or night time. The windows are painted black. There is a light on in the cell 24/7, and thus you don't understand whether it's morning or it's evening. And sometimes they just wait for the command from the guards, like retire, and sometimes it may be announced at 10 o'clock in the evening, sometimes at 11, sometimes at 12, and before that they were not let to sit on a bunk even, so they were only kept standing, and in case people get tired and they get seated, they could be punished for that. Sometimes some people were covering a third person so that they can sit, and now they are already allowed to sit at the benches. And for example, if there are 8 people in a cell and the bench only sits 4, so they sit in shifts. So the conditions are absolutely inhumane. They are designed to humiliate. They are designed to make people not human. Sometimes the people are kept in such places from the year 2014, and they are really isolated from any information. And they get back from captivity and they ask whether Kiev region was already deoccupied. They don't even know about Kherson or Kharkiv region being deoccupied. It's also prohibited, for example, to talk to a guard if you ask any question like what time it is, or you ask them with some request about something, about medical care. You just are not responded, but it all is being accompanied with some physical influence, which definitely is not something that they desire. Well, the prisoners of war, they don't use this type of help, so to say. Thank you for sharing your experience, Miss Natalya. Please, thank you for the invitation. Our organization for more than a year protects the rights of the relatives of the prisoners of war and the prisoners of war themselves, and we also try to search for them. There are some from Mariupol that we are still unable to find, but we found place of detention of many of them, you know, such a non-official place of detention, because, you know, a big problem for the prisoners of war is that Russia conceals them and they try to hide the majority of the prisoners of war. And generally the problem of Ukrainian military prisoners of war is huge. According to our civil sector calculations, it's at least 10,000 prisoners of war who are currently held in captivity in Russian Federation, and the majority of them are not confirmed by Russia. Even those of our servicemen who were exiting Azovstal and International Committee of Red Cross were present during that procedure. They were filling special questionnaires, but there are people who, even in presence of ICRC, are not confirmed by the Russia, as they were coming out with the presence of ICRC. So we had different ways of searching for them. We have different capabilities, but not all of them work. For example, Telegram channels, the Russian Telegram channels, they post videos in their Telegram channels, and this is how we may find those people, or just to find out whether they're even alive, because after Mariupol we're facing the fact that we were not able to identify whether this or that serviceman was alive for a very long time. There are also unions of Russian lawyers who used to help. Now this option is non-existent for us anymore, but back in 2022 and beginning 2023 they were helping in identification of places of detention and official confirmation from Russia. Also, there are Ukrainian volunteer teams which work both in Ukraine and occupied territories, and they make visits to the colonies. I don't really know how they get in there, but it's all unofficial. But this is also how we identify the places of detention of our citizens of war. Back in January, February, March, those volunteers showed us a lot of videos from a colony in Horlivka. We don't know why it was all done, but then they opened big accounts for repairing of barracks, for clothing, and using the sorrow of the relatives. But those guys who were brought back from Horlivka, they say there were no barracks repaired, no new clothing. So is it like a blackmail in exchange for information? Yes, they just let the parents see the videos, they let them exchange the letters, and then if you don't contribute money for repair, you lose all your opportunities. And we also address the International Committee of Red Cross on a constant basis, and they little by little, but eventually they find, or they don't find it, they receive it from Russia. The confirmation about the places of detention is like Ukrainian Red Cross goes to International Red Cross, they go to Russian Red Cross, and the Russian Red Cross goes to the Ministry of Defense, and then all the way back. This is how we get the confirmation of the detention. It's a very small number of confirmations, but still they exist. Yes, they still exist, like maybe once per week or once in 2 weeks. So it's a very small number, but still at least something. Also, there is the working group of United Nations for abduction. We submit applications to them, they consider our applications, but I have to say they're absolutely inefficient. What I have to mention is an interesting thing. There is a working group of the United Nations for abductions. They are based in Geneva, in the headquarters of United Nations. This headquarters is headed by Tetyana Katrychenko, a Russian official. And we were asking if the administrator of the headquarters cannot provide for normal work of yours. They say there is the representation of Russia in United Nations, but they refuse to meet you. So we keep asking if the Director General cannot provide for a normal performance of your duties as the members of the working group for abductions. Why don't you bring up that issue? And it seems like they have no initiative. They're absolutely careless in this regard. So the most productive source of information about our prisoners of war are those who are the same prisoners of war who are brought back. They are the most productive because they communicate, they see with their own eyes, they tell the stories, they share those stories, what was happening to them, they share their some family issues, you know, family stories. So we keep finding them, we keep finding this information from their prisoners of war who were brought back, but still we don't have official confirmation that other people are held by Russia, and it turns out that they are considered missing in action. Thank you, Mr. Andriy. You had a comment. I wanted to react to your speech. I was hearing your address about the dignity, about the cooperation with Russian Federation, how they work with them when they ignore their requests. I liked it, but I would like to draw your attention to those mechanisms that have no content, and it makes no sense to address them or recommend to address them. I want to warn you not to say, don't to put it this way. It's not about that they help, but they communicate with Russian Federation and they continue picking Russians, and obviously those people they are asked about, those people they have more chances that they avoid being beaten, they avoid being treated badly. So the more those people are asked about, the more chances they are safe. So you have to continue insisting, and the things that you were saying, that the United Nations should sort out how come there is the organization inside the United Nations which ignores their principles, but I don't know, there are some methods of reacting, not non-legal ones, like a silent boycott or some special treatment, because one way or another Russia will react to that. And I also want to say, just give me a quick second. You see, we have to raise our humanity in this regard. You see, like the way you were telling this, they were first kept standing, then they were allowed to sit down. You see, this humanity development process, it may be gradual. And for example, in case of ICRC, Red Cross, you mentioned, we have to raise the value of human life, and it will penetrate, those ideas will penetrate those places of detention. Mr. Andriy, so your opinion is that if a person is already mentioned, their chances of staying alive and the possibility that the chances of being brought back home are growing. Yes, there are, for example, medics among the prisoners of war. They're just real medics, but medics are prohibited from being held captive, just like heavily wounded, because heavily wounded they cannot get back in ranks of the armed forces, and it makes no sense to detain them. And yes, we have to address all of the bodies, all of the structures of the United Nations. You have to ring all the bells, and it increases the chances. Well, if I may, a small comment regarding whether it's necessary to communicate the last names or their names. You don't have to communicate them openly, because Russia, they also monitor our social networks, what we say, and I think that this event will be communicated to them too. And sometimes the attitude to those servicemen who were mentioned openly, it becomes even worse, and our close ones, they don't understand why is it happening that way. So those cases described in this study, they were two death cases confirmed by Russian Federation and Red Cross, but at least they got back from captivity in the coffins. And saying that mentioning their names is probably not quite correct. It's maybe more about the mentioning of the problems, of the complex problems. Like Andriy said, we have some influence on the conditions of their detention, and if we talk about the complex problems, we communicate it to the public, to international community. And I would like to draw your attention, maybe we will be watched by the relatives of those who ended up in captivity quite recently, and I would like to ask them to communicate less to the public, in the social networks, like to describe all the details, what was the unit, where was the position, who was the commander, what time they were missing in action. If you have any information about your close ones, so communicate that information to ICRC, Communication Headquarters for the prisoners of war, some civil organization who look for prisoners of war, or communicate the complex problems, but don't do this widespread communication of the names. Thank you for your advice. I hope it will be of help to somebody. Dear colleagues, if you have any reflections, comments, please share. Good morning. I'm a mother of the prisoners of war. I have a confirmation from ICRC and from Russian Federation, but unfortunately, I have no communication with my son. I got a letter from my son back in May, and I wrote back 3 letters to him, and they never reached him. I asked multiple times the International Committee for Red Cross. I wrote letters to Geneva, to United Nations. I have 3 folders of petitions that I was sending everything. All the possible institutions I were sending them. I still get no response. And within the last year, I don't know what is the confinement cell he stays in, what is his condition. It seems like the coordination headquarters, like Natalya mentioned, they gather all the information from those people who were held in captivity and just possible places where my son is, but they are being relocated all that time, so it's a big question. So I don't know what circles of hell I have to go through to find out where he is, what lists is he included on, what are the processes that I should use to bring him back. Also, I was told to hire a lawyer, and I am ready to hire any lawyer who can help me in search of my son. And we were also told that Mykola Polozov alone deals with search of the prisoners of war. I wrote to him, but I got no response. What do I have to do? Where do I find this kind of lawyer? How to solve all those issues? It's not only about me. We have a civil organization in Facebook, almost 5,000 mothers like me, and we don't know what to do. We were going through all the institutions already. Ms. Tetyana, can you please comment on this? Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for stating your problem, telling us about your situation. What's important to understand is that thousands, tens of thousands of families are in the same situation as you are. We understand at the state of Ukraine. I will be trying to defend the state. Sometimes in the very beginning they cannot process this huge number of requests, applications, reports of this massive of information. You mentioned it yourself that the prisoners of war are being constantly relocated. For example, Novozybkiv that you mentioned, they were all kept in one place within the year, including the representatives of the 36th Brigade of the Marines, and now they were relocated to another place of detention. So the way we're looking for information is we question those who were liberated from captivity, and we know how the state institutions question them. Who they ask who was with you in the cell, like who was nearby, and thus they may report to the families that they were seeing one or another serviceman. Sometimes they don't mention the place of detention in view of the fact that they're being relocated. Also, the representatives of the United Nations mission for prisoners of war, they questioned those who were brought back from captivity. They questioned about 400 of such servicemen, and they get in touch with the families and they report all the information they were able to find out. International Committee of Red Cross, they also report a lot. We talk a lot about their inactivity, but within the last month they were able to visit a couple of places of detention in both occupied territories and the Russian Federation. And they also report that information to the families. ICRC sometimes says that they don't have the contacts of the specific families, so they cannot communicate the information directly to the families. They were aware of the place of detention of one of the Ukrainian citizens, but they did nothing to find the family of that prisoners of war. And they were realizing there were requests from that family, but they just were not able to find the contacts in the database. So it's important to make sure that ICRC has your contacts. Just verify that they have your contacts. So it's probably the maximum of the sources of information that I can mention. So first of all, the coordination headquarters, and then the servicemen who were recently brought back from captivity, so the missions of Red Cross, volunteers that I mentioned, and the United Nations organizations. As to the Russian lawyers, yes, we also cooperate with the Russian lawyers. Well, to some very limited extent, we understand every such request now in Russian Federation may result in relocation of a person to another place of detention if we know where such person was held captive. So it would be a very traumatic experience for such a person, because again it's a very complicated process of acceptance. This is why for the time being it's like that. On one hand, we have to understand that it's a huge number of servicemen that the state takes care of each and every serviceman. They try to look for them, but on the other hand, we understand that now at this phase the government may not cope with this, may not make it with this huge amount of the prisoners of war. This is why I always urge the families to work with the coordination headquarters. If we just pile them with their requests, like where, they may not just be able to respond to all of the requests. And regarding this moment, regarding mentioning of the names, it's like we knew that there were some people held in captivity, those who were taken prisoners in Donetsk airport, in Debaltseve. So we understand that the names of those servicemen were known, their families were given interview, and not only military but also civilians. And after they were brought back, both military and civilians, they were saying that yes, it's my daughter or my wife. They were reaching out to media and I was beaten after that, but it gave me a chance of being exchanged, because those whose names were not mentioned, they still stayed there. So those servicemen who ended up there during fulfillment of their duties before the 24th of February, they are held in Makivka colony, and the chance that they will be brought back, given this huge number of the servicemen held in captivity now, those chances are not so big. Yes, after the 24th of February, the situation has changed. Many servicemen ended up in the captivity, and if we write about every single one of them, they will not be able to beat all of them. So if we continue mentioning just one, say, serviceman from the 36th Brigade, they may experience additional pressing, and they may think of them as somebody very important. They will not be given for exchange. So all those stories that you tell that the value of such servicemen would grow if you mention him, if you give publicity to his name. Well, we've been hearing such stories from 2014, but it's all up to the families whether they want to do so or not. In my opinion, it's important for the families to continue saying it, continue mentioning it, not the specific names, but telling about the conditions the people are held in. Because we communicated to the international journalists, we have 4 tours aboard, and sometimes there is an impression that the Ukrainian servicemen are being taken as prisoners by Russia, and then they are being returned, and it's like nothing is happening, and the overall picture is like there is no understanding of the huge number of Ukrainian citizens held in captivity. They are ready to wait until the very last day, as it's mentioned in the Geneva Convention, the last day of conflict. But you know, there are injured, there are people with the psychological conditions. We know about the people who were trying to commit suicide. So the pressure should be exercised to identify all the places, because we have to know about all the places the Ukrainian prisoners of war are being kept in, what are the conditions, and the representatives of international humanitarian missions should be allowed in there, let it be ICRC. But let's say it was only us who identified the 42 places, and then there are more places. For example, we find some servicemen who ends up in some place of detention where they are given the toothpaste with the place of its manufacture being deleted, so they don't find out where they are, in which region. But the Ukrainian law enforcement agencies should document each and every meticulous evidence of all the people who were in different places of detention, and moreover the people responsible for relocation of the servicemen should be identified. Relocation to those places where they were tortured, they were humiliated, where they were dying due to the conditions of detention, and those responsible should be identified. We cannot keep silent. And we keep silent here, and some servicemen in Irkutsk, okay, one of them is being brought back, but the others, they stay there and they are being tortured there by the, for example, the commander of the colony. We know about the cases when the head of this director of the colony, he got drunk, he entered the cell, started beating everybody, and beat one of the Ukrainian servicemen to death. So those are the urgent cases we should mention. I would like to ask you about the map. The map is online. Maybe this information is important for somebody. Can you please tell us how to use it? Yes, the map is online. There is a QR code that you can proceed to, that you can use to proceed to the map. Maybe this information will be of more interest to our international partners, to law enforcement agencies, investigating agencies. We know that the prosecutors' offices and the law enforcement agencies of other countries also support us in these investigations, in these kind of investigations, and we are ready to assist in all those investigations, and we are ready to support you in search of those responsible. We have questions on the floor. What is the number of places of detention identified in Russian Federation, and maybe there is some specific number of places of detention in the occupied territories of Ukraine, and what is the place where the most number of Ukrainian prisoners is being held captive? Well, we know about 42 places of detention in Russian Federation, but we realize that this number may be bigger. This is why we don't stop. We will continue questioning and looking for the servicemen who were brought back from captivity further on, and we will amend this map. As to the occupied territories, I'm not sure about the exact figure. We were working with the number above 100 such places of detention. There are places of mass concentration like Horlivka colony or Sukhodolsk colony in Luhansk region. Those are the places of mass concentration of Ukrainian prisoners of war. Sometimes they are being held in cameras, sometimes in barracks. It looks more like a camp for prisoners of war. Like Iryna was saying that the conditions may be better there, but it looks more like a camp for detention of the prisoners of war, but such places are almost non-existent in Russian Federation. The people are being held in confinement cells with regular cells which are overcrowded. Mr. Andriy, a little bit in response to your question, I would like to say that the problem is not that Ukraine underperforms or ICRC underperforms, but it's about the fact that those federations, those organizations cannot come to Russian Federation using force. It may only be happening when Russia gives them such opportunity, and the question is, what are the conditions under which Russia gives them this opportunity, and this is only then when such window is being opened for such information, and all the international organizations should continue pressing on Russian Federation so that they can provide more information. And the problem is that in are international armed conflict. I use this term intentionally. There is no patron state. It's a patron state. It's something that may sound obsolete, but it's like a mediator. It's like a third country through which this information is being communicated and exchanged. For example, in Geneva Convention, it's contemplated that the report is given to such organization as such third country, and we don't have such organization as the a third country. And in our conditions, we can look for somebody who can exercise that function, some collective body that can fulfill that task, whether an agency of United Nations or ICRC. So this is why we have to address the agencies of the United Nations and mention, not in the context that we mentioned, that we described here, but just to have those names added to their registers, and if they know that something terrible is happening over there, they have more control, or they monitor it more thoroughly, and they become a beneficiary. Like, how come we take care of this person and their health is deteriorated? So it's not about only us pushing this situation, but also them. Thank you. Oh, please, the microphone, please. Well, look, some new agency, some new body, which will be taking care of the prisoners of war, so that they have some mediator between Ukraine and Russia, for example, so that they act as diplomats, so they can influence, they can monitor the exchanges, because frequently it says so that our government prepares the exchange and Russia fails to fulfill the exchange. So it's not the fault of Ukraine that the exchange has not happened. So if the international bodies, international agencies see that Russia does not agree to exchange the prisoners, and many civilians, they also are being held in captivity there. So why is the world silent about that? Why no one is mentioning it? Where this information should be mentioned? Thank you, Miss Natalia. I would like to mention about the patron state, to pick the patron state according to humanitarian law, international humanitarian law. You know, both sides should agree to such patron state, because Ukraine submits such requests to almost all the countries, but Russia in principle would not recognize any third countries, so that they are a diplomat or a mediator between us. So the only mediators that can be between us is the United Nations and ICRC, no matter whether they are efficient or not. But it's the agenda. I think that our country should be more initiative in more active in the international arena, as it was mentioned when we come and tell about the prisoners of war. The deputies, the European parliamentarians, they sometimes, frequently, not sometimes, but frequently, it looks like they're hearing for the first time about the number of prisoners of war, about the death cases, not only of those who were wounded in combat, but they also hear it for the first time about the healthy people who die in captivity. So our diplomacy should be more aggressive. We should press on European countries so that they press on Russia. And to do that, we need the Ukrainian government and diplomatic corps to develop the solutions themselves. We should develop the solutions and offer them to the European countries, because if you want to propose something, you have to know what you're proposing. You have to know the solution, how to make the European parliamentarians press on Russia, because there are political representatives in different international organizations. I mean, the Russian representatives there is still economy working, the Russian diplomats are still accepted. Thank you very much. We still have questions on the floor. Darina Kolomiyets, Suspilna, there is an immense number of civilians and military prisoners of war who are being convicted in Russian courts. Sometimes they are being convicted of terroristic activities. I'm sure you studied this issue too. So what is your assessment of such courts and convictions, and what are the chances for those who were convicted to come back to Ukraine? Well, yes, just last week we were studying the register of the Rostov court, and I personally found about 50 names of Ukrainian servicemen. Sometimes they're retired servicemen who are being brought to courts in Russian Federation. We know about such process with the Vedmit team recently, but in short, no matter what are the convictions, what are the court judgments made in Russian Federation or in occupied territories, they do not influence the process of exchanges. Like an example, for example, last week we found out about the beginning of the process regarding 24 Azov servicemen. 20 of them were being convicted, 2 of them were exchanged, and 2 of them did not show up due to health condition. So one was exchanged back in autumn last year, and another one was exchanged this year in spring. So it does not influence exchange process in no way. Well, according to Geneva Convention, the prisoners of war may be detained until the end of war, and in case of criminal persecution until the end of such persecution. So in fact, where there is criminal persecution, it's not being taken into account during exchanges. This is what we're witnessing. Yeah, I communicate a lot with Andriy, and I want to add that it's not prohibited to convict a serviceman if they're being suspected of war crimes, because there are processes like this in Ukraine. The other thing is that Russia forces them to give some evidences, but when I've seen that register from the Rostov court, they are being accused of terrorism, Article 205, if I'm not mistaken, of Russian Criminal Code. So the Ukrainian servicemen, they are being convicted of being a part of Donbass or Aidar or Azov. So it's not like they're being convicted of war crimes, but are just taking part in the war. Just like Tetyana said, Russian Federation, they have a register, and if a person is a part of this register, they're being recognized as terrorists, not like by fact, by the very existence on this register. What will happen in the legal field? We should come to them and to dispute the judgments, or we have to address the United Nations. They are a signatory of the faculty protocol, and we need the judgments of the United Nations court so that they dispute the judgments of the Russian courts. So this is what we are about to do if we don't get our prisoners of war brought back after the end of the war. Newspaper Fakti, my question is to Ms. Tetyana. You mentioned the case when the director of prison got drunk and he's beaten a prisoner of war to death. So what were the consequences for that prison? I will tell you in brief. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't have access to this place of detention. We were talking to other servicemen who were witnessing, they were hearing what was going on in the neighboring cell. So I can tell you for sure there were no consequences, but generally in Russian Federation there are inspections. They are very frequent. Some higher directors come to those places of detention, after which they usually try to improve the conditions of detention, but there is no independent access to such places of detention. And what was where did it happen? Well, I cannot tell you where it was happening, but please pay attention to the fact that they hide their faces. It means they're afraid. They force everybody to turn around as they enter the cell, which means they're afraid. They want to hide their faces. Yes, thank you very much for the interest to this topic. I want to thank our speakers for taking part in this conversation, and I want to thank our armed forces, the security and defense forces, for this opportunity to have meetings like this. I hope all of our heroes make it back home shortly. Glory to Ukraine.